Well, hello there, I'm Détroit. Instead of drawing something completely crazy today, I want to use this opportunity to learn a bit more about drawing. You could call this a study if you want to. I want to learn to draw portraits. However, a simple portrait is boring, so I'm still gonna put my own spin on it. Let's combine two faces and paste them onto one single head. Now it's something more fun to study. I'm using references for this painting. I found these two pictures that actually have similar lighting orientations, which is pretty nice. The lighting is still different in intensity, but at least the shadows will be in a coherent place. I'm not gonna lie to you, what you're watching could be considered a drawing tutorial, but I myself am following somebody else's tutorial for this. I'm referring to the great videos by Christophe Y that you can find on YouTube. I really love his style of sketching, and the way he colors figures is simply so realistic and good. That's what I want to learn a bit more. By doing this, I hope to learn a bit more about drawing from reference, coloring realistically, but mostly I want to learn how to combine colors with this sort of sketching technique. I mostly color line art, which has a definite edge, so it's easier to lay flats and use clipping masks on them. But what about a semi-transparent sketch instead of line art? Doing line art, like I often do, isn't that realistic, since people don't really have black lines around their features. Sketching intensively is closer to reality, and it offers another approach to art that I would like to be able to do on my own eventually. As you can see, I started sketching without construction lines. This is another thing I want to learn. Again, this is a study. It probably will be a bit janky in terms of proportions, and in the future, depending on my needs, I will use construction lines. Here, I just want to see how I fare without them. For the brush that I'm using to sketch, I wanted to find a brush similar to Christophe Y's. I went through all the brushes I've accumulated over time before starting this recording, but I couldn't find something with a similar vibe. I'm not very good at picking brushes, and I usually like to keep it simple, using round brushes, one inking brush and one paintbrush. I didn't even try to make my own brush for this task today because I have no idea where to start with feathering and the other 1,000 options available. So what I did is I bought Christophe Y's brush set for $4. It's not that expensive, and after trying them a little bit, I can really see myself using them a lot in the future. All of that to say that I'm using the same brush as in the original tutorial I'm following. The way the brush reacts and blends itself with multiple passes, the way it changes its size, etc., I really recommend this brush. It is good and it works very well for this very purpose. And so with all that in mind, I've done a whole sketch of the two faces I will then paint and render. I'm working on a single layer for this, even though I eventually add some shading on another layer, but I'll get rid of it at some point in the process. I can't really shade well with this brush. You can also note that as I finish this sketch, the proportions are indeed janky, like I told you earlier. I'm using a bit of the Liquefy tool to move things around and flipping the canvas, something I should have done a lot more much earlier. And now I can start the render. Something I've always wondered and I only now looked up is how to properly add color to that sketch. And one very simple tip that I took from the original tutorial is to change the sketching layer style from normal to linear burn. I'm not too familiar with it, but the way I understand the linear burn layer style is that it will darken what's underneath it. This way the sketch will appear over the colors and slightly take in the tone of the colors. This avoids the whole black line around every feature thing that sometimes bother me in my line art. From what I could tell, making the flat silhouette is very straightforward. The only thing is to know where to stop the edges. I'm using a very slightly feathered brush for that, so the edge isn't too hard. As for the render, now I'm a bit at a loss as what to tell you. It's kinda simple in a sense, and I kinda based it on my own feelings and intuition. I'm using a soft round brush to first add darker tones in the darker areas, building darker and darker zones with every pass so that they sort of form complex gradients everywhere. At the edge of what can now be considered shadows, I add a lighter and very soft reddish tone. That is for the subsurface scattering that makes your skin redder at the edge of a light. Basically, without getting too into it, light reflects onto your skin, but also penetrates it a bit and reflects from the layers of tissues underneath the skin as well. That reflection will be more red. You can see it easily by putting your fingertips in front of a light, or looking at light through someone's ear or any thinner part of the body. The rendering process is a lot of blending and reshaping the very soft edges of every area to define the features, like for example the roundness of the bottom of the chin or the slight depression in the cheek. Sometimes you need to add harder edges where the skin folds, like the wings of the nostrils against the side of the cheek, or more evidently where the eyelids fold over themselves. In these areas, the folds will make the light unable to enter and the shadow will then be a bit stronger. These are occlusion shadows. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out this video in the top corner, especially the part about light and shadows with the different kinds of illuminated spheres. I don't know about you, but personally, when I work on a long time with the same kind of thing, I get bored at some point, so it was a real pleasure when I worked on the eyes. Instead of using peachy tones like I've been doing so far, I finally get to use another color, with a green that is complementary to the skin tone. You know, drawing eyes is strange because it's both really easy and really hard. In theory, it's really easy. Once you know how light interacts with the glassy surface, like an eye, placing the highlighted white dot and the light part at the bottom is easy. So is blending the lighter and darker part. The real work was actually during the sketching process. Eyes are one of the things you notice the most on somebody's face, if not the most. As humans, we spend too much time looking at other people's eyes, and we are intrinsically familiar with their position, their shape, and simply their vibe. Because of that, if there is the slightest jank in an eye drawing, it instantly loses realism. For a drawing, it is also a bit strange to represent somebody with crossed eyes, even if you want to do it on purpose, but it is easier to do it than to make the eyes actually look like they are looking in the right direction. The eye is a sphere, partially hidden by the skull and the eyelids, but you still have to think of them as spheres. The curve of the eyelids will be impacted by it, as you can think of fabric bunching up against a spherical object, but also being pulled on at the sides, near the corners. To represent it, imagining a full sphere will always result in a better render. The other important thing is that the iris is circular, but it sits on the surface of a sphere. It means that unless the character is looking straight at you, the circle will appear like an ellipse when drawn on a 2D plane. It is easy enough to know it, but doing it is much harder. A lot of times when you see eye drawings on TikTok, Instagram and such, it looks really nice and fancy, even professional, but you rarely see somebody giving drawing tips on eyes, plural. Because of course somebody will have two eyes, and both need to be of the same shape, oriented the same way, with irises of the same size. And that is where the struggle is. If you isolate one eye, it looks good, but the two combined is really hard. Another thing that is a constant struggle for me is the hair. For this study piece, I honestly didn't want to bother. I'm still very far away from even beginning to understand how to draw hair realistically, so I won't get much into it. Maybe I will practice more and eventually you will see a study session dedicated to hair on this channel. You have to subscribe to know for sure when I do it. Let me touch a bit into highlights now. Unless you want to make the skin look wet or sweaty, don't use thin bright highlights. Instead, opt for much softer light tone. So soft to the point that you almost don't see it. The only places I do highlights on skin that is dry is on the eyelids, because they make the eyes pop a bit more, the tip of the nose, and the lips. The lips are wetter, and shaping the highlights will give texture to them as well. But for the nose, it's because usually noses are a bit more greasy than the rest and thus more shiny. But don't add a white dot. Blend it a bit more. It still isn't completely wet looking. That is my tip about highlights on a face. Depending on the style, you may want to use more or less, but for something realistic, that's what I recommend and what I personally do. Now, I only have two more things to talk about while I render this twin portrait. At some point, I flatten all the layers together into one. This allows me to again use the Liquefy tool to reshape the faces a bit. The girl looking down has her nose too high up, and the girl looking straight has a chin that is too large. You know, don't hesitate to use the Liquefy tool, it is really useful. It's not a cheat, it's a time saver. In Photoshop you can even use its more complicated features like the face recognition. It doesn't work on this particular portrait because there are two faces and the head is strange, but usually it recognizes the eyes, the nose and so on and allows you to easily tweak them. You can tell the program to move the eyes closer together or make them bigger or accentuate the mouth, etc, etc. It is worth looking into at least when you reach the end of a whole rendering session, and only then you realize that you had proportions wrong this whole time. Finally, the last thing I want to say isn't that much of a tip, but a bit of backstory. I didn't plan it at all, but looking at the expressions of the two women together, I came up with their name. Here are sorrow and hope. I think it encapsulates the mood well. There isn't one without the other, just like pain and pleasure are intertwined. One is looking to the past, looking down and deep in sad thoughts, while the other looks straight ahead at the future, bright and, well, hopeful. I like that idea. I didn't plan on it at all, but it feels good and complete this way, you know? I hope you enjoyed this study session and that, like me, you learned a lot. I recommend you check Christophe Y's channel. If I don't forget about it, there will be a link in the description. Give credit where credit is due, you know? Leave a thumbs up and a comment if you like this video. Maybe tell me what you want to see me draw next. Subscribe for a lot more art content in the future and check out my progress in arts on my Instagram at d3_sd. My Twitter is @Detroit if you want to chat, by the way. I'm Detroit and this is my variety channel. Bye!